I'd actually like to talk about political debunking.
Okay. What about political debunking?
So something that really bothers me is that in this age, truth has become subjective, and that really bugs me. How do you become skeptical and debunk, what are objective fallacies on either side of the political spectrum?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this idea of truth being a subjective construct has rattled a lot of people's brains because it kind of makes the conversation seem like you can't actually gain any ground. I know you've dealt with this specifically in some of your videos, GM Skeptic. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, one thing is when we're talking about relative truth or personal truth or something like that, a lot of the time the way that people break it down is a thought experiment. And I'll say my piece, and maybe Dan, we can break down the thought experiment together, the whole thing with the gumballs or with the Tic Tacs or whatever that a lot of
I have the gumballs here, by the way.
So the first thing that I'll say is when it comes to subjective truth, I don't think people are always actually valuing truth or thinking truth is somehow subjective because they actually intellectually entertain that. They think that that's how the nature of truth is that. I think that it's a kind of cognitive dissonance, and the reason why they end up touting this idea of subjective truth, or that they can have their truth and other people can have their truth or whatever, is they want to hold on to what they already believe for some reason. Maybe it's an emotional reason or whatever, but they hold on to that so tightly that they're able or they're willing to redefine truth entirely. And ultimately it has, I think that actually figuring that out in a conversation has more to do with figuring out if they value knowledge more than belief, and not just what do they think the nature of truth is. It's not just as simple as doing the gumball experiment or the thought experiment, but I think that is one important part of it in trying to do thought experiments and say, what is the nature of truth intellectually? Like, how do we actually entertain this? So as far as the street epistemology, as far as I know, the street epistemology created thought experiment of the gumballs or Tic Tacs. Dan, would you want to run through that?
Yeah, so that's this. Let me grab these gumballs over here. Oh my God, I got all this fire. Okay, so there's these gumballs here. Has a whole jar full of them. And if I were to ask you how many are in here, you might not be able to tell me. You know, there's a lot of them in here. We can't just tell.
I could do volumetric estimation.
Yeah, you could do a guesstimation. But what I would ask you more importantly is, even if we don't know exactly how many gumballs are in here, I could ask you, is it either an odd or an even number of gumballs? Like, can we agree that it has to be either even or odd? And hopefully somebody would say yes, unless there's some other construct of numbers that doesn't fall into the binary of even or odd, you know, and that can be with like 0 and some things. But like if I said to you, look at this jar of gumballs, and you said there were 0 of them, then we're not talking about the same thing anymore, right? So it kind of starts with this idea of you can break things down to at least some level, and whatever level you can break it down to, if it has to be odd or even numbers, you know, you can't say that they're both odd and even, or you can't say that they're neither odd or even, because at that point, it just doesn't make sense semantically. You're not really describing anything. So that's one way to kind of use as a thought experiment, is to ask someone, okay, can we at least agree that there's like an odd and even number? And you can kind of like break down questions from there. Yeah, as far as, I've never encountered anybody that has actually said all truth is subjective. But it can be tricky when we talk about people's quote unquote versions of the truth that they have. For example, some people might say like a religion is true to them and not true to somebody else, which as a descriptive claim, actually, like, yes, it is true to you and not to everybody else, but that doesn't mean that we're all sharing in the same kind of universe at that point, if that makes any sense. Because if you're using like rules that only apply to yourself or your own worldviews that don't apply to other people's, then I would say that I mean, you can call that delusion. You can call that just a break from reality. It just doesn't match up with other people's experiences. And that would be kind of the problems that we face when we have these kinds of conversations.
But you see, that's a very ground up, very first principles approach. But the problem is much more systemic than that. It's the, for example, in the gumball experiment, you have to see the gumballs and recognize that the gumballs exist in common and so on. I've found with recent events and phenomena that a lot of people refuse to even accept the existence of common facts and commonality, and this gets really fervent when political tribalness gets asserted. Now, the best way to do this uncontroversially, to give an uncontroversial example, would be policy. We can actually figure out whether or not a policy is effective or not by doing evidence-based policy formation. That's something that's being practiced around the world. You can create micro experiments and see if it works, if it impacts parametrics, and so on and so forth. And yet, even if you show people the evidence, it doesn't. They refuse to see the evidence, and they don't accept that it's real.
Yeah. So here's my advice on that, because that does happen. You can show somebody some people some evidence, and then they just don't accept that. Either there's a psychological rejection, or they don't quite understand the information being presented to them, or maybe the information itself is wrong in some form and it has been presented in the best way. There's a lot of things you can break it down, but sometimes showing people the evidence for something doesn't work. And actually, most of the time it doesn't happen, because we don't always accept facts that don't already collude with our worldviews. So my suggestion is, if you're trying to suggest someone that one policy is, say, better than the other, a lot of the science has shown that if we can make arguments that are more centered around someone's values, for example, if you're talking about gay rights with somebody, whether gay people should have the right to marriage just like as much as straight people, an issue that, although it's kind of been solved, there's still people who disagree with that assumption. If you make it under, if you imagine, if you're talking to somebody, like that who disagrees with that, you can make arguments that they would make for other kinds of things, like, oh, these gay people are hardworking Americans, they serve our country, they do all kinds of things. So you're kind of making these appeals to like patriotism, you're making appeals to loyalty, all kinds of appeals that they might agree to, that might be more convincing to somebody than saying like, oh man, you just don't care about, this is a human rights thing, this is like a, something that like doesn't necessarily appeal to someone who leans more to the right than it would to somebody who's on the left. So you can kind of work with those kinds of value structures that people already have, and kind of make your arguments more compatible with those structures.
Could I suggest another example? Because I'd love to see you work through it.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the economists who helped design the policy behind Medicare and Medicaid, the original Medicare policy, they pointed out when there is abject market failure when it comes to the patient and doctor and insurer level of healthcare, because each entity has misaligned incentives. The incentives of the doctor don't align with that of the insurer. For the doctor, it's about delivering care. It's not about delivering objective goals or just getting them into tests and so on, and repeatable outcomes and blah, 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 blah. It's about delivering care, whereas for the patient, it's about getting well and so on and so forth, whereas for the insurer, it's about reducing the cost of the exercise, and where a doctor might suggest something that might be more expensive, but it might be better for the patient's long-term approach. The patient might want to see the doctor more frequently, which is actually shown to reduce, to reduce chronic health outcomes, because it's more likely that the doctor will see, oh, you are overweight, you're probably pre-diabetic, I need you to do this and this and this. So you're more likely to catch ailments earlier. So it's in this triad, every entity has a distinct motive that's separate. And this is what leads to market failure, precisely because the insurer has the most information, the doctor has a little bit more than the patient, but not enough. And the patient has the least amount of information and no amount of choice, because you have to, you're going to value your life to an infinite degree. You will always do something to save your life. Your parents, your spouse, your children will also value it to quite a large degree. So therefore, there is no other option than to opt into the healthcare system.
Right.
So therefore, you don't have the element of choice that's essential to a capitalistic market.
Yes.
So even though money is being exchanged in this, it's not exactly a free market. It's a perfect example of what the economists call market failure. Now, convincing someone who is, for example, a right-wing libertarian of this fact is next to impossible, because they won't even recognize the term market failure as being real.
Yeah, whatever the market says goes. Like, the market can never be wrong, right? Yeah.
Exactly, except markets can be an artificial construct. In some cases, they are self-forming and spontaneous emergent phenomena, but just because there's an exchange of money does not mean that there's a market there. So getting some people to recognize this is next to impossible.
Yeah.
Even if I show them the studies, even if I show them that, hey, behavioral, they've done the math. It doesn't work.
Yeah. So again, it's about appealing to the values, you know, the reason why there's a lot of people, or the kinds of reasons that people say why we shouldn't adopt a single-payer healthcare system is, of course, they talk about choice. They talk about, oh, we want the Americans should have the right to choice, and that's these appeals again to this individualism, this these kinds of things that we already value in our, you know, as Americans, basically, that we've come to value as a culture, and that can be an effective argument. Again. The effectiveness of an argument can differ from like whether actually something or not is good or bad, or in a sense worthwhile for somebody to have. You can make a pretty good argument, for example, either way, whether we should have protections on like free speech and stuff. I mean, it's all about framing. It's all about figuring out what is going to appeal to the person the best, and that might mean getting to know that person a little bit and seeing what kind of things that they're interested in. I know a lot of the people that I talk to when it comes to like healthcare stuff, you know, they're interested in, okay, but does the system work? Does it make economic sense? You know, and that's something that they value. So maybe if I was to argue for like a single payer healthcare system, for example, not saying that I would or wouldn't, but if I did, I would make those kinds of appeals. I would say, okay, well, this is how this would make sense in an economic way, because I know that that's what you care about. And this is, you know, if I go to them saying, oh, I just want everyone, I think healthcare is a right for everybody to have, and you should agree with me, you should share this value with me, then your case for arguing with somebody is going to not be as effective, not because it's not right and not because it's not true, but because it's not going to appeal to them the same way. So
yeah, people make decisions not based on reason a lot of the time. It's like the supreme being which makes the decisions ultimately in our minds, or even just maybe initial decisions usually isn't the reasonable bit of our minds. We make decisions based on other things, and then we kind of sort things out reasonably later on, if ever. And, you know, what we advocate for is to try to use that reasonable bit as much as you can, while acknowledging that you're not always going to be able to let it take over your brain all the time, and neither is anyone else. So it's really we're not trying to be perfect with how we convince people. There's no perfect logical argument that's going going to do it. It's really just approximating what we think an ideal is ultimately when it comes to trying to convince anyone or just being reasonable in general. We'll never be perfect, but we can get closer and closer. And I think that history demonstrates that we have. Hopefully, we'll eventually be able to convince people with reason a little bit more reliably than we can right now.
Yeah, for sure. But it's a great topic to bring up. Thank you for calling. Really appreciate it. What was your name?
Mira, and thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks again.
And apologies for my little girl in the background.
Yeah, it's all good. Well, yeah, thanks again for calling in. Yeah, as far as, again, like you're talking about improving better and better, I was reading this week on some of the arguments that people were having for like owning slaves back in the day, or why it wasn't something that was as spread fast as one from our generation might look at that from was, well, we need to respect the owner's rights.
Yeah.
These owners have these rights, and we can't just take away their property like this. So like it's an entirely different framework of mind that you're working at. Something like every single person having individual human rights may not have been a concept that they had that people who owned slaves may have valued at that time.
Right. Yeah, it was kind of a values change rather than just people using straight reason or straight logic or empiricism to try to prove one way or the other. There was a lot of appealing to values and value changes fundamentally. And oddly enough, it seems that making a decision or changing your mind based on empirical fact is more surface level and would be easier because it's not supposed to affect your entire framework, right? Like one fact doesn't have to necessarily. It's more on top, but your values they're closer to the bottom. And yet it seems that you can affect some of the things that are closer to the bottom, sometimes more reliably or more effectively than things just at the top. But don't we want to affect the things at the bottom rather than at the top if a lot of the stuff at the top is wrong?
That's true. And like, what if we do need a change of values? How do we make those kinds of arguments? It's a whole other thing. And I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I might have some ideas.